The healthcare industry stands at a critical juncture. It is grappling with formidable challenges such as escalating costs, inefficiencies in service delivery, and the pressing need for personalized patient care. Technology-driven transformation has never been more urgent. Web3 technologies, AI, blockchain, IoT, and extended realities, herald a new era of innovation poised to redefine the contours of the healthcare industry. Welcome to W3B Talks, an ongoing discussion about Web3 and blockchain's impact on business and society. I'm your host, Doug Heinzman. I'm the Chief Catalyst at BRI. In this special episode on Web3 and healthcare, we're joined by Ray Dogum, an industry engagement manager at Vibe Bio. Ray's also the host of the Health Unchained podcast. Ray will also be featuring this discussion on his podcast, and I recommend you check out Health Unchained to delve deeper into the challenges facing the healthcare industry.
Hey, Doug. Good to see you.
Likewise. Topic number one. Where do you want to start?
Yeah, a lot of places to start. I think one topic a lot of people are thinking about these days is artificial intelligence, AI, machine learning, big data, LLMs, which is large language models for those who might not know, and how that's impacting healthcare, medicine, clinical trials. So maybe we can start diving deep into that and kind of...
I think that's fair. I think that AI has kind of grabbed it's the zeitgeist of the moment. And in a lot of parts of the healthcare industry, ranging from various different life sciences companies to health networks to pharmaceutical companies, AI is top of mind. So I think that's probably a pretty good place to start. I think most people will have seen some of the headlines around, quite recently, MIT's discovery of a completely new class of antibiotics that look to be very effective against antibiotic-resistant strains of very dangerous bacteria. So they used AI to look through a large library of known molecules, and then they were able to reduce it down to some small number of high probability candidates, and have been testing it in mice now, and it looks like to be a major breakthrough, but it's AI driven. So that whole area of drug discovery, I suppose, is one of the first areas that AI is going to kind of grab our imagination.
Absolutely.
What have you seen in that space?
Yeah, I agree. I think drug discovery is a huge area because there are so almost limitless numbers of molecules and biologics that can be imagined, right? And scientists and researchers can really only focus on a subset of them at a time. It's really difficult to sort of run millions of iterations without a computer. So now that we have the capabilities and things like DeepMind and other sorts of platforms now, it's kind of created this biotech wave, a new wave of biotech technology, that's funny, right? But it's just really amazing to see what's going on in that space. And I think we're only at the tip of the iceberg, because in pharma, biotech, it takes many years for a drug to actually get approved. There are at least 3 phases of studies done, making sure that this drug, whatever it is safe, is super important. AI can also help with that too, right? So there's lots of different ways AI is involved. Another way I think AI is cool is not just the drug discovery part, but being able to identify which patients would fit for a specific drug. Because something that I think we haven't really done well in the last, 20, 30 years is focus in on a patient and what their needs are specifically. There are these sort of one-size-fit-all medicines that many doctors are prescribing based on protocols they have to follow because insurance companies require it so that they can get paid. But there's a lot of variation between person to person. And although a doctor might not be able to fully embrace those differences just because it's hard to do, they have a limited amount of hours in a day. But AI could, I think. It could take a person's genetics, take the way that they live, their environment, and factor that into what medicines or what therapies or just treatments they should have. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, I think it makes total sense, but there's even a bigger issue that the productivity of drug discovery has fallen dramatically over the last 70 years, something like 80-fold. It currently costs about $2.2 billion and somewhere between 10 and 12 years to bring a new drug to marketplace. The financial case becomes much more difficult for pharmaceutical companies, And the general population just isn't exposed to the same degree of innovation around drugs. And AI, I think, changes that because it starts especially when it converges with a bunch of different technologies, it opens up some new ways to approach this. And what you're really alluding to is the advent of personalized medicine. Now that we have genetic testing and sophisticated test results, we can start to discriminate the population. We can start to have molecular discrimination. And that can lead to some really interesting outcomes. 56% of drugs that do not succeed the development process and don't get through clinical trials, they fail clinical trials because they can't demonstrate enough efficacy to get approval by the regulators. And of course, efficacy is determined. This is the gold standard is double-blinded randomized studies. So that kind of implies we're going against the general population. But if you subsegment the population and you've got a group of people that are from a particular ethnicity or live in a particular place that has a higher incidence of exposure to certain kinds of environmental toxins or whatever, but some way of grouping people, then a particular drug may be tremendously efficient and show very high degrees of efficacy for that particular subgroup of the population, where it doesn't against the general population. So if we have ways of compartmentalizing the population into these very different groups, there's all kinds of drugs that may have very important relevancy to those populations. So if on the one hand, we've got the reduction of the cost of genetic testing, and on the other hand, we have AI that is looking through the vast library of molecules that we have out there, that many of which have already demonstrated low levels of toxicity and other sort of side effect things. But we can start profiling these drugs to very specific populations, and we can start approving many, many more drugs. The FDA's got, I think, 4 new fast-track procedures to bring drugs to marketplace using these personalized medicine channels. And I think AI has a huge role to play. And I think this is one of the biggest breakthroughs that we're going to be seeing in the next few years, because it's going to lead to much better health outcomes, much less cost in developing and bringing good quality drugs to the marketplace.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think there's maybe something that people don't really know is, like you said, the productivity issues in pharma and biotech has been dropping. Actually, last year there were 55 novel drugs approved, and there are probably at least 500 or maybe biotech pharma companies out there, most of them small, that are trying to figure out ways to get their drugs approved, essentially. So
I think something like 22 or 24 of those, which is a very large percentage, almost half of them, came through these personalized medicine fast-track procedures. So we're already seeing the shift and the proportion of this new class of very targeted drugs become more important. And there's this related issue that if you're going to use AI to scan through all of the databases to find out all these really interesting drugs, then you've also got to think about how you redesign your clinical trials. And you then have got the opportunity to use AI to figure out how to find the right participants and how to make sure that they're properly balanced so that you can get the right answer to the question that you're asking with the trial.
Absolutely. That's definitely been a challenge. Patient recruitment, finding the right patients, especially for diseases like rare diseases where you don't really have huge populations to enroll. We need to figure out a way to do that more effectively, because these companies, these pharma companies and biotechs are spending, like you mentioned, like $2 billion to get these drugs approved. A lot of that goes into the clinical trials and marketing. But if we can identify certain workflows that people do every day in terms of what apps they use, how they connect with social media, and kind of feed into those platforms and enable them to sign up for clinical trials in a way that's more, I don't want to say comfortable, but more familiar to them, I think that's going to create lots of opportunity for recruitment. One of the issues that brings up, though, and you probably might be thinking this already, is what about their data privacy and how is that going to be managed? So a couple of things to unpack here. One, the recruitment side of things, but then how do you conduct the trials? Are these trials going to be on site where a person has to go in for testing and get treatments and they have to essentially be there for those tests? Or is it going to be more decentralized clinical trials, which is a really big topic these days as well?
I think those are all, great. And I think we're going to be going through an interesting era where we're going to be sorting all those things. So, and there are other pieces of it, right? So it's not just the AI piece, it's the IoT piece starts to feed into this as well. The idea that it isn't just people's DNA or their epigenetics, and it's not just the results of the various different tests that we administer when we take blood or urine or whatever, but it's the fact that the cost of collecting data about people's health and various different vitals, as well as their social interactions that have an impact on health, that we're getting this much more holistic picture, and that's generating a tremendous amount of data and patterns. And AI starts to be able to look through those various different patterns and figure out what optimal courses of treatment are.
Exactly. And I think, as you mentioned, these patterns, AI is very good at identifying patterns, probably better than humans, right? And given enough time and computational capacity, I think AI is going to take over a lot of the thinking that we do, or a lot of the memory that we have to hold in our heads, and we would sort of outsource that to them. And when I say them, I don't know exactly how it's going to be, but essentially what we would do as humans is build on the AI. We'd be the creative function, coming up with the new ideas and trying to work with AI to create these new products or services.
Oh, I think you're touching on a really interesting other part of this story, which is diagnostics. Already today we have AI engines that are better than over 95% of radiologists in terms of interpreting MRI and CAT scans and PET scans and all those kinds of things. And I think the idea of having an AI engine that has had the benefit of reading, all the medical journals in the world and processing all kinds of medical records to discover patterns of the results from various different kinds of tests, and or incorporating and doing inference around the tests and the IoT measurements from a particular patient in a particular circumstance. The potential of having that kind of doctor's assistance or diagnostic assistant has a tremendous of power. And I know a lot of people's interactions with the healthcare system involves going to a general practitioner who then refers you to various different specialists. And if they can't find something, you get referred to a different kind of specialist, and you bounce around. It takes a number of months and a bunch of different specialists to kind of look at the situation and try to figure out what exactly is going on. And there's a few organizations like the Cleveland Clinic that try to assemble a diverse team of specialists to look at a situation in a very kind of concentrated way. And most of us remember that wonderful TV series House, where they kind of used that approach, and the whole thing was kind of a Sherlock detective sort of thing to try to figure out what the diagnosis was. And they had a team of people that all had different expertises to figure that out.
Great show.
Yeah, it was a wonderful show. I've been watching a few snippets on YouTube lately to remind myself of the processes that they used. But if that show existed today, you'd have to think that one of the characters would be an AI engine that was constantly being queried and fed input to. It wouldn't be quite as dramatic, wouldn't make as good television, I guess.
Yeah.
But
I can see Dr. House screaming, what did the AI say, or something like that.
Or maybe they cast the AI in the role of House, right? So that's another area. Any other impacts of AI in the healthcare landscape that come to mind?
Well, since we're talking about clinical trials, personalized medicine, a lot of companies actually spend a lot of their resources trying to figure out which drug assets to prioritize. So you have a mid-sized company who's owns patents for maybe 5 different molecules, let's say, or assets. Each one they've spent millions of dollars going through the development process for each one. And then they need to decide based on their budget which ones to prioritize, which ones to cut or put on the shelf. So there's like a dilemma here, right? There are patients that could benefit from this drug, but they don't have the funding for it. So what they do is they end up just holding on to it AI might be able to help in that decision-making process. So if we were able to, like you mentioned, take all the previous databases that exist for all the drugs that have been approved, maybe all the drugs that haven't been approved but were in development, and sort of compare them and benchmark them against each other, you can identify some interesting patterns again, and maybe make the optimal decision based on all the data instead of just what maybe 4 or 5 people think is the best decision. So that's another way that we're seeing it. That's something that we're doing actually at Vibe Bio right now. And there's plenty of other applications. I'm sure people listening we'd love to hear from you, of course, always.
I could see that as being an important subject. The healthcare is incredibly expensive. And a lot of that expense involves, well, I think I was going to use the term over-testing, but that suggests a motivation. And to a certain extent, there is an unfortunate external motivation, which just happens to do with risk averseness, that when in doubt, test a lot because you might get sued for malpractice because you didn't do the one test that turned out in retrospect to be the thing that could have discovered something. And so defensively, you do lots of tests. But also, just up front, someone presents with a bunch of mysterious symptoms. You do a whole bunch of tests to try to figure out what the problem is. And those tests lead you to do other tests. And all of that is incredibly expensive. It may very well be that AI will, in getting us to the right answers more quickly, and being able to suggest an ordering of the tests that if you knew the answer to this, you wouldn't even bother looking for these other things and doing these other tests. So being able to take out a lot of cost of the system by optimizing the decision-making process, I can see a significant application of the technology to that problem.
And we're seeing it now. I think there are tons of companies trying to do this, and it's interesting to see where their data sets are coming from. I think we have plenty of public information available from the FDA and NIH and other sources, but then you have companies that also have their own proprietary data. We're watching it really closely to see how the landscape kind of unfolds, but essentially I think it's good overall for humanity. I think as we're seeing with ChatGPT and other sources, the accessibility of AI has become really, really good or accessible for people.
There's 3 other areas. Well, there's probably more than that, but 3 other areas kind of occur to me off the top of my head.
Sure.
One that is less thought about in the healthcare space, but it's really essential, and that is supply chain management and optimization. A lot of people don't really appreciate just how much and how important the supply chain and the cold chain is to the healthcare industry, and the huge amounts of costs involved in optimizing that, moving it around, making sure that the right kinds of inventories are in the right kinds of places. We saw some of this come to a head during the pandemic when we didn't have enough masks, and then we didn't have enough of this antiviral, and then we didn't have enough stocks of vaccines, and then the vaccines were in cold chain, and some of the vaccines had to be chilled down to minus 72, and they would spoil if they had excursions outside of a very small range. And these are all, very real issues, and there's a tremendous amount of cost associated with that. And a lot of healthcare systems, actually vaccines is a really good example, a lot of healthcare systems to mitigate the risk of just not knowing enough about how to optimize the system, they over-ordered, and they just have big buffers of vaccines that many of which spoiled and became, unusable. But they felt that was the most rational way forward, was to buy lots of stuff and buy it early and reserve those spots. But of course, the net effect was that, especially in the early days of the COVID-19 vaccines, it's a zero-sum game. So if you're locking down all of that inventory, then someone else isn't getting it. And it's a global problem. So that's just a small example, but that applies to all kinds of stuff. That I think the combination of state engine, which kind of gives you that transparency and that system awareness of what stuff is and where stuff is, combined with AI that can look for those patterns and do predictions about what is going to be needed, where and when, that the combination of these things should allow us to have better functioning and much more efficient supply chains.
Yeah, and a couple of things are necessary for that to happen, right? We have to actually have healthcare systems that are willing to share some of their actual needs in the system or in like the database or on the blockchain or however you want to build it. And in addition to the cold chain management supply issues, we have things like drug counterfeiting and making sure drugs that are being sold in certain countries are real, right? And I know there's a project in Europe, there's a consortium called PharmaLedger. You might be aware of it. They're pretty involved in their one product service offering, which is EPI, which is like electronic product information. Essentially, what they're doing is using blockchain to generate an approval of a government authority that this drug product information, basically the leaflet that you get in a drug container, is correct and accurate. All the information is true. And when a pharmacy receives that, nothing has changed. So it's the same electronic leaflet. That's important because I think without those signed proofs, there are lots of potential fraudulent drugs being sold on the market, potentially dangerous, potentially non-effective. So being able to implement blockchain in a really smart way, which is, I think, the biggest challenge, is how much information do you really need to put on the blockchain versus on a shared database, for example? What are the incentives for participants to really care about continuing this network and supporting the network and maintaining the nodes, as an example? Those exercises are challenging, but it's happening, which is really, really cool to see. It's taken some time for larger companies to really take an appreciation to all this, but I do feel like it is happening. I'm a big fan of blockchain, and I do think that it is going to revolutionize the world, the way we perceive relationships, the way we interact with companies, brands. And I think this financial revolution conversation that the world is having about not just Bitcoin ETFs, but what about sovereign debt and sovereign money and fiat money? What does that really mean in our digital world now? Lots of these conversations are happening. I do personally, and please let me know what you think, I do think that this financial revolution with blockchain needs to happen before the healthcare data revolution happens. I don't want that to be the case because I do think that the healthcare part of the progress we'll make using blockchain in healthcare, I think, has more value than just the financial side of it. But as you can understand, they're very much interrelated and connected. So, and a lot of people understand money runs the world, as they say, for better or worse. But yeah, just some thoughts there.
You raise an interesting point. I'm not necessarily convinced that the two are quite as codependent as you're suggesting. But going back, just to step back to the point you were making about the counterfeiting, the WHO estimates that there's about almost $80 million a year in counterfeit drugs, which is a pretty big number. And in North America and large parts of Europe, we've got pretty high quality supply chains, and it's relatively difficult to introduce counterfeit drugs. But in a lot of places of the world, that is just not true. In fact, it's more commonplace. And there's also piracy. There's a lot of people that are intercepting pediatric oncology drugs that are very expensive and substituting in placebos into the supply chain and then selling these very expensive oncology drugs on the black market. So there's all these sorts of issues. I'd even talked to one pharmaceutical company that was experimenting with putting edible ink onto individual pills. So an individual pill would have a QR code, and you could scan it and understand and see the provenance. First of all, see the contents and all the side effects of that particular pill, but also understand the provenance and the chain of custody of where that pill was at any given point in time and who was responsible for it. So that's a pretty extreme example, but I think we are going to get a lot better at tracking and tracing things like pharmaceuticals through the supply chain, and that's going to give us a much safer system. I think that is a very good point. On your point of the intersection of finance, of course, you're right that all the nefarious actors out there that are doing piracy and doing counterfeiting, you're going to want to control them. And for those of them that are using cryptocurrency to do their business, you're going to want to figure out ways of clamping that down. But quite frankly, the people using cryptocurrency for those nefarious purposes is a teeny fraction of people just using American dollars. So I'm not necessarily sure that's the most attractive thing to go and chase down.
Another point, just to support what you're saying, is when you put it on the blockchain, you can't really remove it. So if there was a transaction made and they had any missteps along the way, the data will be there indefinitely.
The second topic, going back to AI, was the idea of AI therapists. That people with mental health issues, they're finding a lot of success in having AI therapists trained on large language models that are specialized, that people actually are more comfortable interacting with them and can benefit quite considerably. So finding very cost-effective ways of delivering some pretty high-quality therapeutic interactions is another potential area that we may see become more commonplace and develop.
That's a really good point. As mental health has really become a huge problem, not just after COVID, but even before COVID. And now, as you also know, loneliness is a huge issue. So just having someone to talk to, not even in a therapeutic way, but just as a companion, especially as our population is aging, that brings up a lot of different ideas for me of how AI can be useful.
It's funny you mention that, because that was the third thing I was going to talk about, was this idea of personal assistants that are companions, that are with you all the time, that understand what your calendar is and what your exercise schedule is and what you've been eating and what your various different gluten intolerances or dairy intolerances or nut intolerances are, and can engage in conversations with you or give you advice or be your personal trainer or your personal assistant. This is a really interesting area. And when you see companies like Meta and Ray-Ban getting together to create new sunglasses or glasses that have cameras and microphones in them that can record things and interact with an AI engine to provide contextual advice, right? They can identify a person that you're talking to and say, you last talked to them 5 years ago and here was the setting and this is what you talked about. That's pretty cool. There's a company in France called Sanofi, I think, and they have implements on cell phones, but they have a personal assistant that they've deployed to their entire organization. And it's really interesting because it provides contextual advice. So if you are doing a tour of a warehouse, for example, and it can give you advice about inventories and shortages and stuff that you need to know when that's in the context you're in. If you're about to walk into a meeting with the marketing team, it can give you, here are the top 5 questions you need to ask them. Here's the performance of the marketing plan for the last 3 quarters. All that kind of contextual advice. There's another company that I've been doing a little bit of work out of Europe that is applying what is known as the checklist manifesto, the idea that if you have checklists, you can dramatically improve the quality of a process. But they're applying it to the laboratory environment so that as technicians are doing experiments and working through how to create new therapies and drugs and stuff, that they have this projected environment that's giving them all this contextual information about safety procedures and about the anticipated interaction of various different kinds of chemicals. So this idea of having AI that's there thinking with you, that understands the situation, the context you're in, and is providing you with that high quality advice about how to perform optimally in any given situation. That is what I can imagine that for a surgeon, right? That they're sitting there and the AI engine is kind of watching over the shoulder, so to speak, and is saying, well, watch out about the arterial vein that's doing this, this, and this in 30% of cases that have this underlying condition. This is a weakness.
It really is amazing. I definitely see the potential of all of these applications, and I think it will continue to get better. But I'm actually curious about, I'm wondering if people want to hear about some of the limitations of AI too, because I do think there are some limitations. You mentioned like the surgeon, let's say they're wearing some sort of glass device. Oh, by the way, Snapchat was doing it with Ray-Ban, I think before Meta was, in terms of the, but I think they dropped that project or something. But AI is only as good as the data that it was trained on. And what we've seen, especially in medicine, is we are still unable to predict a lot of the situations or able to diagnose a lot of patients, even with the best doctors, even with at the best hospitals. One concern I have about AI is that we rely too much on what the AI suggests or recommends, that we stop or we don't take into account personal experience or maybe anecdotal evidence that was mentioned. So, and I think what I've been seeing in the space is there's a lot of these AI companies, but they're also introducing like this human, like a man in the middle sort of experience. So, for example, on ChatGPT, you type in a prompt, you can say you like this response or you don't like it. You can give some feedback as to why you don't or you do like it. So it helps to train that AI. So there's always going to be that continuous model or a continuous feedback loop, essentially, which is good. But I just have this concern that people will stop making feedback recommendations and just trust with 100% certainty whatever the AI says. So, and that goes for most or a lot of different applications. What do you think about that?
Well, I think to some extent, the issue that you're alluding to is true of any technology, right? Whenever a new technology is introduced, whether it is a blood pressure machine, a dialysis machine, or whatever the technology happens to, that as those technologies are introduced, there is always and should be a degree of kind of healthy skepticism that says, well, this is a really good tool that moves our understanding of a situation forward, but we need to apply some reasonableness and some testing. A novel technology, we don't have a lot of experience with it, and we need to admire it for what it does, but incorporate it into our decision-making as an assistant instead of as something that we're going to rely on. I think AI is somehow distinctive, especially these new generative models that have this conversational nature to them. I suspect that you and many of our respective listeners had that uneasy feeling that, oh, that was spooky the first time that they used ChatGPT 4, when they asked it a question and then took that answer and had it rendered in a Shakespearean sonnet form, that there was something weird about the whole experience. And I think that was because of the interface, that it has this conversational nature to it, and it had this human interaction. When the first diagnostic assistants, the deep learning systems that came out of things like IBM's Watson, they were asking deep questions and it coming back with answers. They weren't generative and conversational way that these new models are. And we figured out ways of incorporating that information into the process of performing healthcare. With these generative models, I think there's a tremendous amount of potential there because conversational interfaces are very informative, right? We use that procedure in diagnostics. A doctor sits down with a patient and they have a conversation. They ask questions. Those questions inform the next questions. The answers to those questions inform a strategy. And it's through that conversational process that, or doctors consulting with other specialists, right? It's through that conversational process that you arrive at the right answer. And so having an AI engine, and hopefully increasingly good AI engines, being part of that process, I think makes good sense. Of course, we know they hallucinate and they make up bad facts. But we also have to recognize that the models that we're using casually are trained on enormous data sets. And as great as and amazing as they are, they inherently have certain kinds of biases, and their fine-tuning and refinement isn't perfect. The new large language models that are being applied in the healthcare space are much more specialized, right? They're not going to be able to have Shakespeare do fancy things, but they know a ton more about fibrosis or some sort of special disease. And I think that relying on them is one issue, but I think that having them offer an opinion that can help inform a diagnosis, I think will only get better and better. I actually do think there's an interesting potential problem, and maybe I'm over this, but I have this sense that if we've got the world's best diagnostics AI engine, who would want advice from the world's second best diagnostic engine? And so will there be a concentration? Will there be a natural monopoly effect around someone that owns the best AI diagnostic engine out there.
It does present some kind of winner-take-all situation. I don't know the answer to that. And it's really interesting. I think second best will probably be pretty good, but why would, like you said, why would you use it when you can use the best one, especially when it comes to your health and medical issues? So I guess we'll just have to see. And I wonder if, given the amount of data these large tech companies have already, will they be the ones to be the winners, I guess? Or will it be the EMR companies? Will it be like an Epic or something?
So I think this is a really interesting question. There's a dovetailing. So there's two pieces of the equation, right? There's the training set, and then there's the inference question. In the training set, I suspect that the highly segmented nature of the American healthcare system is actually going to be an inhibit. That there are some populations, and the two most obvious ones that occur to me are Canada and the UK, that have a combination of some very interesting attributes. One is that they have enormously diverse ethnic populations, that you can find very large groups of people from pretty much every corner of the planet in those countries. And the second thing is that they have government-sponsored public health insurance. And as a result, they've been to have pretty solid consent management and consistent consent management. And they've built very long and wide and deep healthcare records. So they've got large data corpuses of very diverse population that go many, many years. So I suspect that in terms of training sets on clinical results, that there's going to be data sets coming out of those kinds of places. In terms of inference, which is the second part of AI that says, how do you interpret a particular situation? What variables do you provide to the system that you're asking it to comment on and predict on? There, I think there's different places that are going to have much better access to the DNA information, much better access to inexpensive testing and monitoring technologies, including in-field monitoring and testing. And so I think that there's going to be some advantages of the geographies that have access to that level of technology.
Makes a lot of sense. And there are plenty of companies in Canada and the UK trying to figure this out too. And it doesn't necessarily have to be companies there, because US companies can work with.
The challenge is having access to enough diversity in the training set for it to be really useful. And the second problem is making sure that you're on side of all of the regulations, which takes kind of the medical healthcare problem. If we could solve the electronic health record problem, that might be the single most cost-effective way of improving the quality of healthcare, certainly in North America, probably in the world.
Blockchain could be a really important tool here to allow a person's own medical data and information to be permissioned to be used, maybe not for the model, not to train the model, but in order to get results about your own medical situation. But if there's a way to use zero-knowledge proofs to kind of also use it to train the model, that would be amazing too, because then you can really make some serious progress.
Yeah, I think we're getting very good at the aggregation, abstraction, anonymization, zero-knowledge proving that we can build training sets, as well as we're generating all kinds of synthetic data that I think is going to be pretty useful, that isn't encumbered by those privacy regulations. I think the biggest way of kind of flipping things around right now is our healthcare records are highly segmented. Our general practitioner owns a chunk of our healthcare record. The hospital we visited 3 years ago because we needed stitches has part of our healthcare record. Some specialist, your eye doctor, your hearing doctor, your infectious disease doctor, they've all got some pieces of your healthcare record. And there are some health networks that, by virtue of the fact that they have various different specialists that are associated with the network, that they can aggregate those records. And so there's some grouping of those records. But all too often, they're highly segmented. And so any given healthcare professional interacting with a patient at any given point in time is only seeing a slice of the picture, doesn't necessarily have access to the much bigger picture. And so all these people own the state engine. And quite frankly, in some systems that are highly incentivized around private practices, doctors are loath to give up control of that because their ownership of that state information is very sticky, right? Part of the reason you always go back to your doctor is that they have his history and own that. The big change would come if we get to a self-sovereign identity where the model gets shifted around, and the model basically says, listen, I am a person, and part of the extended nature of my identity is that I have a bunch of healthcare records associated with me. And as I interact with various different parts of the healthcare system, regardless, and as they're interacting with my records, they're interacting with me instead of interacting with some other doctor or some other hospital. They're interacting with the records associated with my identity. And as they add more information, the content of my extended identity gets augmented that other professionals would then situationally have access to. But in theory, if you had a super user, a super doctor that needed to know everything, they could see everything, not only everything that exists right now, but everything that has existed across most of your life.
If you had an AI actually review your entire history, you'd need some way to be able to share it with them as well, right? So having the self-sovereign identity is something I think that will happen eventually, but I'm not sure when. It's such an interesting thing just to consider because our identity with our citizenship, wherever we live, is so tied to, like I said, our healthcare, our ability to get a loan. There's just so much tied to our identity with our citizenship, to our ability to travel. There's no self-sovereign identity at the TSA. There's a lot of limitations there. But as a concept, I totally agree with you. And I do think there's plenty of people promoting this concept and working towards this sort of legislation where it could become more of an accepted concept. But from what I've seen, there's been a lot of pushback, though, unfortunately.
There has been pushback, and part of the reason is that the only way you really make that kind of system work, you can't have people self-declaring, I am so-and-so because I say I'm so-and-so, and then build your own records and have people trust. You can have teenagers telling everyone that they're 21 years old and allowed to drink. And you're like, but is that true? So you have to have some sort of authority that basically says, we're setting up the system, we're going to make it unhackable, we're going to make it immutable, it's going to have these kind of characteristics. And likely that's going to be a government. And it's likely going to have core elements like your citizenship and your right to vote and the core services, how you interact with government services, because there's a lot of obvious advantages of doing that. And we could save a lot of costs just in terms of how easy it is for an individual to interact with the great variety of government services out there. Arguably, there is a quasi-governmental service. It's near infrastructure. And it's certainly highly regulated by government. So, it makes sense that it'd be one of the most obvious candidates to be appended to a self-sovereign government ID. But then this gets us into this big issue that people are paranoid about the government having too much control of our lives. But once again, they don't quite understand the way this system works is that the government doesn't actually own the state engine. They don't have a master database where this is all being set up, that they are sponsoring the infrastructure to support it, but individuals own their own identity. So it's just a matter of education. We have to help people understand how this technology works to get them over the fears involved in the concentration of that amount of information in one place and the potential for it to be misused.
That's a really good point. And even if we think about another benefit of using blockchain is in terms of cybersecurity, you're removing this honeypot of data as well. So people can't necessarily infiltrate a health systems database or EMR record system and keep that data locked down. With a decentralized system, each individual person's record is owned by themselves. They would have to hack each individual private key. So that's another benefit.
Of course, we'll have to figure out what the reasonable research uses are of that data. Because one of the advantages of having centralized data is it's efficient for very valid research reasons to be able to go and look at that data and discover patterns and figure stuff out. Whereas if the information is self-sovereign and is controlled by a bunch of people, how do you do that? So anyway, these are problems to solve. Really quite high quality governance to control the crowdsource, but be able to focus resources on attacking very niche medical needs that have long been ignored because the people in that DAO either believe that there's going to be a financial reward for solving that particular problem that other people haven't recognized, or they have a personal reason. They have a family member that is afflicted by that disease, and so they want to concentrate their efforts on that. I think that bringing capital in a very focused way to target all these individual issues that may affect a particular subgroup of the population that has a common ethnicity or a common disability or a common whatever is a really interesting manifestation. And when you kind of pair it with all that personalized medicine and drug discovery stuff that we were just talking about, I think there's some really interesting potential that could come out of that.
And we're seeing a lot more researchers now with many more projects. So what we're seeing, I think, is this huge long tail of projects that are not getting the attention they may deserve, but that, like you mentioned, there are these pockets of communities forming around specific. It could be a drug asset. It could be just an idea. There was a company called Hair DAO. It's a DAO where the community came together, pooled some money in order to conduct research on hair restoration, different techniques for hair restoration. And I think they raised a few $1 million. So it's really cool. I think there's been a lot of excitement for it in that past few years, especially. And there's still a lot of potential to conduct this sort of pooling of money. And just to add to what you're saying, DeSci is even more than that. DeSci talks about the way to decentralize scientific publishing in general, because a lot of publishing now is also centralized with few really controlling sort of publication companies. I'm thinking like Nature and Cell Biology and all these organizations. So if you were able to decentralize it and make it public and more transparent, you can have a lot more information and research available to the public, so you can have just more people engaged with the science. But yeah, in terms of
do you risk? I mean, I think that's great, and I can well imagine the potential. But do we risk polluting the quality or diluting the quality of research? Because it's great that everyone's a citizen scientist, but quite frankly, I will respect the results from the Mayo Clinic or something written in Nature or the New England Journal of Medicine. I would give it more credence because, first of all, who's writing it, and second of all, the fact that it's gone through a rigorous peer review and editing process, and that the publisher has decided that there is enough merit here that they're willing to put their reputation behind it. That there is that filter that that improves the quality of the science and thus makes the time that people are spending on working on the science more efficient. Is how do we overcome that problem in a decentralized world?
And a huge challenge as well. A couple of things I'll mention. Although there are many protocols and processes in place so that if I write an article, do some experiments, I send it to Nature, there's a peer review process. But what's to say that we can't have a peer review process similar to Nature, maybe in fact even more rigorous, but traced and tracked on a decentralized ledger, so that who's doing it, who's doing the review, without revealing the name of the person. You just know this is a qualified peer reviewer, verified. You don't know their name because you want to protect their integrity, but that can sort of help with the peer review process. One thing I meant to mention about DeSci as well is when you think about these projects being funded, these DAOs, great, you get a community together, but what's to say that fundraiser for the researcher raising this money, how do we know that their research or what they're working on is actually being done properly, correctly? So there's also this risk with DeSci where you still need to be able to trust the individual or team or group that's conducting the research too. So there's a lot of factors that play into this. Personally, just really quick, I do think that IoT is going to play a huge role in this, where when you're doing a lab experiment, pipetting something, there will be a camera, a blockchain-enabled camera that's AI-enabled too, that can observe what you're doing as a human and detect whether or not it's a deep fake or not as well, and sort of monitor the integrity of your work. So it's kind of weird thinking that all your work from all your failures will also be recorded, but I think that might improve some of the quality.
Well, you're on a good point. It is frustrating what a large percentage of of research out there is non-replicable. That either through outright fraud or people interpreting results optimistically because they believe that if they only can get access to the next grant, they'll figure out the answer, or doing selective omission of various different clinical trial results on some argument that they shouldn't have been included, but it affects the outcome and beautification of the output data, right? There's all these different things that affect the quality. And I think that if a lot of the data is ledgered and or, as you were suggesting, captured via measurement devices, IoT devices, and that those results are ledgered, that we can get a much greater degree of comfort in the quality of the underlying data. One of the questions I've been thinking through is I've been looking at a lot of academic research and investigating the peer review process, is whether we will have AI reviewers, right? We already have AIs that look through most job applications, right? HR departments are using AI to process resumes all the time. So will we have AI engines that perhaps are specifically trained on specific domains, on oncology domains, on muscular dystrophy or diabetes or whatever, that will review various different submissions and then perhaps provide the human reviewers with a guideline of issues that it believes may be problematic, right? Or data that does not pair up with the existing dominant data in the marketplace.
Right. Or maybe even the dogma in whatever field you're in. I think that would be very beneficial, not only to improve or reduce the amount of time it takes for someone to peer review your article, because it could take up to years to publish an article, especially if it's groundbreaking potentially. They want to make sure everything is accurate and it makes sense. I guess I definitely see that being an application, and it sounds like it probably already exists to a certain level and continuously getting better. The one thing I would just mention to keep in mind is science is always changing. We're always learning new things. And if the AI, again, was trained on previous data, it might not be able to make that leap into the new understanding of whatever we're experimenting with. So that's just something to consider. It'll be interesting to see how, on the opposite side of that, AI could maybe make bigger leaps. Maybe they'll have better ideas.
Well, you're on a really good point. And you've probably run into something with the large language models like ChatGPT, where it'll basically say that according to my last update, which was December 2021, this is the person that is the prime minister of this country, because that's when the training set ended. So they can't fill in the blanks after the particular date they were trained on. And they can't even use reasoning to figure out who the prime minister is. That's a matter of fact rather than a matter of opinion. Well, it depends on what country you're living in, but
yeah, fair.
We won't go there. So that is a valid issue for some kinds of AI. It looks like we're on the breakthrough on some new kinds of AI, specifically around reasoning engines that will be a lot more creative. And we're also seeing emergent behavior, that systems that work, especially with a lot of synthetic data, playing chess, or even this one that we talked about from MIT, that it went and discovered a novel class of antibiotics that humans hadn't been looking at, hadn't been working. We didn't understand that mechanism. So it's not a matter that, it's a search like Google, right, that you can't find something that doesn't exist yet. They were able to discover patterns that suggested completely novel approaches that didn't exist in the literature. And that is really pretty exciting in my mind.
It is very exciting. And it's only going to get better. Like you mentioned, these reasoning models, I think, are still in their infancy. But once we get to a level where they're beyond a postdoc PhD or a 30-year MD, PhD in a particular subject, it's going to be amazing. It's going to be, that's when the revolution will happen, right? Or at least that we'll feel it. I'm excited for it all, really.
Yeah. So and we've been talking about kind of a lot of the back end systems, and there's some amazing technology that is being brought to bear and it's changing the world. But when it comes down to our individual personal interactions with the system, at some point, healthcare is about people. And it's about improving the quality of their lives. How do you see these technologies changing the relationship between people and the healthcare system? And And or are there any sort of ethical questions that we need to kind of think through as we posit what the desirable state is of how we interact with the healthcare system?
Yeah, good question. I think we mentioned this earlier, but the first person you typically go to when you have an issue medically is your general practitioner or PCP, primary care, and they have to basically triage what's going to happen next. There's a limited number of these sorts of people, at least in the United States, and I think in other countries as well. So I think AI can play a huge role in that triaging process because it's not as complex as maybe a cardiovascular issue or maybe something's wrong with your one of your valves or something. It's more you would have to go through testing. But if you have an initial issue, AI is a perfect solution, in my opinion. Once these reasoning models do a really good job and we've had enough evidence and proof that they work personally consistently with different types of diverse populations, that's also very important.
Let me just make sure I'm parsing out what you're saying there, and correct me if I'm making a leap too far, but I think you're saying that right now our primary healthcare interaction is with our primary care physician, our general practitioner, and they're the person that you go to ask the first questions, and they help you. They have a holistic view of what's going on, but that we'll likely have at least a part of the personality of our personal assistants will be a proxy for that primary care physician, that will have an AI engine that will be having a dialogue, that will be watching our sleep patterns and our eating patterns and our exercise patterns, and that's where we will go to ask the first level questions about our overall health, and it will make recommendations about what else you should do.
I think if you trust the platform that you're using enough to share all that information, I think the resulting responses that you'll get could be immediate, which means you don't have to wait to go see a doctor, make an appointment. I think it doesn't have to only last 30 minutes. You can continuously work with this AI general practitioner. They can learn more about you over time, more than your typical human GP would. There is something lost there. I will say the relationship between the GP and the human might be lost in the process. So I don't know how we'll really deal with that, or if that's even an issue for some people. But that's kind of the only downfall or the only adverse effect of that.
I know that there's some physicians out there that it drives them a little crazy when someone walks into their office having read a WebMD article, or even worse, some Facebook post, and think they've know more than the doc. But at the same time, it's quite often, I've had even personal experiences where the reading and research that I have done has been an invaluable contribution to a good outcome for myself, that the doctor hadn't seen something that I had found and added that to the conversation. So it'll be interesting to see as we have access to these super WebMDs, these artificial intelligence ones that aren't just repositories of information, but are dynamic, living, breathing, well, not living, breathing, but dynamic, personalized, right, adaptive conciliaries and kind of health professionals on demand. It'll be kind of fascinating to see how patients, how individuals equipped with those kinds of facilities, how they in turn interact with the healthcare system.
It will be interesting to see. And just imagine the cost reduction in the healthcare system as well with those abilities. So again, I think there is caution in this field, in the healthcare field with AI already, but that's probably a good thing because we don't want to, I guess, unleash the genie before really knowing what's in the bottle.
Well, what do you think the genie is? What's the nightmare scenario?
Well, if people are getting surgeries based on what ChatGPT said right now, I think that's really concerning. And I don't think any provider would do that. Maybe if ChatGPT or another sort of model recommends a supplement or some sort of like therapeutic drug that they could buy over the counter and they over supplement or overdose, or there's a lot of things that can come up, and depends really on the therapeutic area.
The other thing that's been concerning me, I haven't quite figured out how it all plays out. Right now, there's different components of the system, including the component of how we pay for things. And in the US, we have a whole bunch of private insurance companies that pays for most of the healthcare for most Americans. But quite understandably, from a business standpoint, a health insurance company will want to have really healthy people in their group that they can collect a lot of premiums from and pay out as little as possible, because that's what returns the most to their shareholders. But as we get into an environment where you can send off your saliva to 23andMe or Ancestry.com or any number of genetic testing, or your doctor does it, and they can show you genetic markers that tell you that you have an increased likelihood of breast cancer or prostate cancer or any number of diseases, Hodgkin's and Alzheimer's. On the one hand, having that knowledge and incorporating that knowledge into your healthcare record, so that as people and healthcare professionals interact with you, that they have a larger knowledge base, that they can diagnose with greater precision, that they can prescribe the most optimal therapeutics and drugs and all that kind of stuff, makes total sense. And at an aggregate societal level, it makes total sense. At an individual level, if you have that new level of information and you've got AI engines that are able to incorporate that inference information into a model to basically discriminate and say, oh, you have an X amount of probability of being a more costly customer of my insurance company than the next guy, then you end up with a lot of ethical problems that the economic drivers of business decision-making is going to drive an outcome that may not be aligned with societal benefits. And we're going to have to come to terms with that. Geographies that have public insurance systems may be less problematic because they have an interest in the overall public health. But in private insurance systems, I think we're going to have to figure out what the ethics are and the regulations are. And I think that's going to be pretty challenging.
It will be challenging, and we'll have to see. I feel like there are so many areas we could talk about in terms of who should we cover or who shouldn't we cover based on pre-existing conditions, and who should we, especially as people get older too. I think there's a lot of conversation needed around death, essentially, like what happens as you get closer to dying, and how much should we spend for someone who's 95 years old and spend in getting $300,000 worth of surgery so they can live a few more weeks or something. And those questions are really, really challenging. And I am no expert in it. And I welcome ideas because I feel like there's a lot to still learn about in that space. And there's a lot to learn.
And I suspect that our points of view would be different if we were actually in that demographic versus not being in that demographic.
That's very fair. So yeah, who's making those decisions exactly?
Yeah, it's an interesting conundrum. Oh boy, well, these are interesting times that we live in, and
it's the greatest time in the world ever in history. Yeah. I think.
And in this space, I think healthcare is one of those areas that this group of technologies that seem to be converging into a platform, blockchain, AI, IoT, and extended realities, that the convergence of and the maturity of these technologies, healthcare is one of the domains where the impact of that convergence is going to be the most profound.
I agree. You're nothing without your health. You really aren't.
Well, what's your prediction? Going out question. What are the big news items in the healthcare space and its intersection with these technologies in the next 5 or 10 years?
I've actually been really fascinated with this concept of electroceuticals, like leveraging micro currents and electricity through the system to kind of rejolt organs or cells or specific systems in the body. I'm not an expert in it. I just find it fascinating. There's been a lot of research in it, and it might take us to the next level of our understanding of biology, because it's not just a chemical or physical process, but there are certain quantum mechanisms in place in our bodies that we still don't understand. And I think I'm just really excited to learn more about that. Hopefully AI can get us there faster.
I think that it's probably something to do with the brain. That mental health and brain-related issues. So the brain is the last great mystery in healthcare. I mean, there's a few other little, I don't mean to diminish them because a lot of them are very important, but the brain is the last biggest piece of the puzzle that we do not understand. And the ability to do increasingly personalized medicine and the potential of deploying new classes of medications and or other therapeutics, including electrical therapeutics, I think have an enormous potential to change the welfare of a pretty significant portion of the population.
Very interesting. I agree. I think the entire nervous system is fascinating, and we only know a fraction of what it really means.
Well, this has been a great conversation.
I really enjoyed this. Thank you.
I enjoyed this. It's such a fascinating topic, and I'm grateful that
we covered a lot too, actually. So I appreciate that.
It's been great fun chatting with you, Ray.
Thanks,
I'm
Doug.
glad we made this happen. My regards to all of your listeners.
Likewise to yours. Thank you. Thanks for the time. And if there's anyone with questions, happy to talk to you at any point. Feel free to reach out. I'm on LinkedIn.
Well, great question. How do we contact you, Ray?
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn and Twitter. You can find me Health Unchained. Pretty easy to find online. Ray Dogum.
Cool. And likewise, I'm on Twitter and LinkedIn, Doug Heinzman, and you can find our W3B Talks podcast on most podcast platforms, as well as at our website, blockchainresearchinstitute.org. Thanks so much. We'll have to check back in 5 years and see how well we predicted the future and how many of these things actually came to fruition.
Let's do it. Let's put it on the calendar right now.
Okay. Anyway, take care, Ray. This has been great fun.
Likewise. Thanks, Doug.
Okay, cheers. Bye. Thank you for joining us for this episode of W3B Talks. You can find details about how to follow Ray on X and LinkedIn in the show notes. You can also find the Health Unchained podcast on most major podcast platforms, and you can find out more about 5Bio at 5bio.com. You can find more information about this and many other topics at blockchainresearchinstitute.org. And while you're there, please consider subscribing to our newsletter. I'm your host, Doug Heinzman. We hope that you've enjoyed this episode and that you will join us for our next episode of W3B Talks.